Hello and welcome to our first, if not one of many, LinkedIn Live events where we're hopefully we'll answer some cool questions and get your feedback on what we're doing and how we're moving forward. I'm Craig Cooper. I'm a North American sales manager, and we have Ross and Graham with us, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a second. But first and foremost, this is about your questions mainly. We have some pre-built questions that we'll ask and get the feedback of everybody. But we want to hear your feedback and questions as well. So pop them in the dialogue below, and we'll stick them in there, and we'll answer them the best we can. First, I'm going to pass it to Graham, and Graham, I'm going to ask you a question so you can introduce yourself in and answer a question right after it. But we're going to talk about PoE loudspeakers a lot today. So why don't you start with an introduction and just tell us what PoE loudspeakers are all about?
Okay, thanks, Craig. So yeah, I'm Graham Harrison. I'm Vice President and General Manager at Bluesound Professional. And what is a PoE loudspeaker? Well, at its core, a PoE loudspeaker just by itself is a loudspeaker that uses category cabling rather than conventional speaker cabling. It's always receiving digital signal, and PoE stands for Power over Ethernet. So it is also receiving power to allow an amplifier built into the speaker to work. So at its core, that's what a PoE speaker is.
Awesome. And Ross, I'm gonna pass it up to you, but I think a good question for you to start off with is if you could explain the differences between the different types of PoE power.
Sure. Well, most people would know about regular PoE, typically used for very low-powered applications. We actually use it on our CP100 wall mount controller. But beyond that, our speakers typically use what's called PoE Plus, which is 30 watts of PoE power, or PoE Plus Plus, which is 60 watts of power. Our largest PoE speakers, the BSP 500 and 1000, give you the option of either using PoE Plus or PoE Plus Plus. And those are basically the supplies that we use, either delivered via a switch or an injector. Most times our customers are using switches like from Netgear, Cisco, Ubiquiti, for example, and you can use unmanaged or managed switches. And probably the most interesting thing to be mindful of is the overall budget. For example, if you're using, let's say, 8 speakers that require PoE Plus 30 watts, you just multiply 8 times 30, and you make sure that that switch has that overall budget so that you have enough power.
That makes sense, and it reminds me. This is a good time to tell you guys about this project anyway, but I won't get into too many details. But it was kind of interesting. So it's a series of PoE speakers, let's say 16-ish, and they have a sub with each one, and they're building a custom enclosure for each one of the speakers. So it's a series of 4 speakers in a sub in one, we'll call it a tower. And the integrator was like, "Oh, hey, do I have to run a home run to every single one of these towers, or can I put a smaller PoE switch in that tower?" So explain how that kind of works, maybe like the hub and spoke concept.
Yeah, certainly you can locate a local PoE switch as long as there's AC power available for the switch to plug into. And so you could have that locally and run short runs from each of those speakers to a 4-port PoE switch, and then run a network cable from that switch to your main switch. Would be the only connection you would need leaving that. That way, you don't need to pull home runs from that tower all the way back to where the main switch is.
I think
we'll be getting. Go ahead, Graham.
Sorry, I think that brings in an interesting point, which is the PoE bit of the network has to be the last bit before the speaker. So, for example, you couldn't run a PoE cable through PoE signal through another non-PoE switch. It doesn't pass through. So when you're configuring a hub and spoke, it's got to be the last switch in the chain that actually provides the power. And the other thing about PoE that I wanted to say is that it's an IEEE standard. So the way we use it is the way that everyone else uses it, which is why, as Ross said, you can use anyone's switches as long as they're certified PoE plus or PoE plus plus. And in the world of the Internet of Things, where more and more endpoint devices, cameras, also, all sorts of smart endpoint devices need power, PoE, PoE plus, PoE plus plus, and later iterations are becoming more and more common and more affordable.
That's going to lead me in my next question, but rest assured, we'll get pictures of this install because it's a cool location, it's a cool brand, and it's a cool use of our devices, which kind of leads me into this question is, how are our PoE speakers different from other speakers in the marketplace, PoE specifically?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was trying not to answer that in the first question. So, a standard PoE speaker is one that can take a signal, amplify it, and reproduce it. Our PoE speakers actually have streamers built into them, and we have a patent around this, so that what you're doing is basically running, usually streaming music services, business music services, from the internet through the network directly to your speaker. And then the speaker's doing all of the work. The speaker's decoding the stream, it's then amplifying the signal and reproducing it through the speaker itself. So basically, our PoE speakers are a whole system in a box. You don't need anything else apart from power and access to the internet. Now, when you're using our PoE speakers, usually you're using more than one of them in a facility. In that case, what you're doing is grouping the speakers where one of them becomes a primary, and that's the intelligent speaker at that point. It's taking in the stream from the music service, it's decoding it and reproducing it through its local speaker. But it is also at that point sending it back through the network in a proprietary uncompressed high resolution file format, along with timecode information, to all of the other speakers in that zone, which then become secondary speakers. They can be right or left channels, or they can run in mono. They are all time aligned so that the signal has no delay. And it's a very flexible system. Any of the speakers can be primary and the others then become secondary. So you can split your space temporarily, recombine them into bigger groups. And it's a super flexible, decentralized way of running a system.
I think you kind of got at quite a bit of this, Graham, but maybe expand on problems is not the right word. What opportunities does this present in the commercial space specifically?
Sure. So, pardon me. I often go into spaces where they're using what I'll call conventional streaming speakers. And I'll go into the space and I'll ask the customer what they're using. And they'll say, I have whatever it is, brand X streaming speakers, and they're wireless. And I'll look up, and every single one of those speakers will have a wire going to the speaker. And I'll say, well, why is that? And they'll say, well, that's just the power. And I'll say, well, but it's a wire. And by the way, if you're wiring AC power to every single speaker in a space, you've got to have an AC outlet around usually the top of the wall next to every speaker. And particularly in the US, but pretty much internationally, that means you have to have a licensed electrician come in and wire up those AC outlets, and you usually have to get permits for them. So it's extremely expensive. So you end up with really expensive power because AV integrators are not licensed to put in AC power points, typically. You have extremely expensive power, but then you're streaming your signal wirelessly. So it's possible that it can drop out. So you have expensive power and unreliable signal. And kind of that's the worst of both worlds. If you use category cabling and power over Ethernet, you have one cable, it's supplying the music and the power over the same cable. It's running at typically somewhere between 48 and 52 volts. So a AV integrator can install it. You don't have to have local AC outlets. It's super flexible. People, when they're looking at costing a solution, need to look at the whole cost of the solution. Not just the cost of the boxes, but the cost of the cabling in between the boxes, and also the cost of the labor to install that whole infrastructure. And what we find is very often using decentralized PoE endpoints can be the most cost-effective solution when you look at all three of those things: the cost of the equipment, the cost of the cabling, and the cost of the labor.
That's a great answer. Not that I'm saying that this is a recommended install, but I know a great chef who was tasting his menu and pulling category cable to install his own speakers in a restaurant. The food is phenomenal there. I tried it out, and it sounds really good there. Speaking of, it sounds really good there. How do the PoE speakers sound?
Well, I'll give you my opinion and then throw it back to you, Craig, because you've got a lot of experience of jobs. But pretty much during the pandemic, we were selling our products virtually, and we sold quite a lot of our players and player amplifiers because we could demonstrate those well in a webinar. We could, we could show people the software, we could show people how everything worked. But we weren't as effective at selling speakers. What we found, though, was after we were able to get out and travel and actually play people the speakers, our speaker sales skyrocketed. And I think people have a perception that PoE speakers don't sound very good. And we were able to dispel that myth, and our PoE speakers sound, I would say, better than most passive speakers, because we were able to build DSP into the endpoints and optimize every speaker for the drivers it's using. We're able to optimize efficiency because it's a closed loop system. The speakers, the amplifier, and the streamer are all in the same box. So we can get a lot out of a little box. And usually when we demonstrate it to people, they're absolutely blown away. But I'll throw it back to you, Craig, because you've done a load of installations, or you've been in a load of installations in the US. What do you think?
I mean, I absolutely agree. I'm not an audiophile by any means, but I really like the sound of them. I think that they perform really well. It's great to have, great friends in PSP and NAD that help us make them sound that good. I do remember a different chef in installing one of his bars, which we're installing one of his restaurants. I got to go down and take a look at it in a couple of days. But we were down in his cocktail bar that he was building, and he was sitting at the bar and was like, "Hey, Craig, this sounds really, really good. I can actually hear the difference in the instruments and things like that." And he mentioned, it's something that we don't think about. And I was like, well, you're giving us the best food you possibly can, the best drink you possibly can. It's an experience. And he's like, well, this is now part of the experience. So it wasn't a tough push to get them to use us on his next restaurant, which is, that's all the endorsement I need, right? When somebody hears it and says, I want to buy more, that's pretty much where we want to go. They sound good. Hey Ross, how loud can they go?
We're typically up around 100 SPL in most of our devices, and which is more than enough, certainly for background music. And I wanted to latch on to the sounds good part. I was internally, we were working on the BCS 300, and one of our guys was just absolutely blown away how great it sounds for such a small unit. I always get asked about why we don't have bigger and bigger speakers, but I say, with our DSP, we can make that small box sound so good. And I'm just hearing reports on that time and time again. So we're pretty excited about these products.
Yeah, to expand upon what Ross said, when he said 100, it's 100 dB C-weighted at 1 meter from the speaker. And to give you an idea of how loud that is, in New Zealand, we have them used in factories, big industrial factories, which isn't an application I was particularly thinking about when we designed the speaker. But if you can use them in factories, they're probably good enough for most applications in terms of volume. And in terms of quality, I have a pair of our littlest PoE speakers up in my kitchen. And for context, I also have a pair of $12,000 hi-fi speakers in my listening room. And yeah, they don't sound as good as the $12,000 loudspeakers, but it's not that far away. I mean, I'm very happy listening to my speakers in the kitchen. In fact, probably spend more time listening to the speakers in the kitchen than I do listening to the speakers in the listening room. So yeah, I think it sounds fine. In fact, more than fine. Fantastic.
Why aren't other manufacturers doing this? Getting in the PoE game.
Well, I mean, there are other manufacturers getting into the PoE game, increasing number of manufacturers getting into the PoE game. But as I mentioned at the beginning, they're using kind of more endpoint type loudspeakers where they're typically running Dante protocol through a category cable along with the power to the endpoint, and they have some central DSP doing the matrixing and that kind of thing. Whereas what we're doing is this radically decentralized approach where the endpoints are everything. There isn't a center. The center is the network. And that's really a 21st century way of doing things there. This idea of no center, just cloud-based infrastructure. Why didn't they do it before us? I think probably the reason they didn't do it before us is because we're the very first ecosystem of streaming audio equipment that's specifically designed for commercial spaces. And in the home, PoE is not so much of a thing yet, although it's coming. So maybe the residential brands just didn't think it was worthwhile doing, or I'm not really sure. Because we play exclusively in the commercial area where PoE is an everyday thing, it seemed the right thing to do to take advantage of what is often existing infrastructure and power the speakers that way. So that's probably why we were the first to do it. As I mentioned earlier, it's patented, so other people can't legally come in and do it. And whilst I'm not a big one for restricting the playing field and being protectionist, equally we had a good idea and we wanted to protect our good idea. So there are more and more speakers, PoE speakers, coming into the marketplace, but we are still the only streaming PoE speaker in the marketplace. Occasionally, I get asked, there was quite a big job where the end customer wasn't comfortable wiring category cabling right to the endpoint because they felt it might limit their options later on if they decided they didn't like the speakers and they wanted to put in more conventional speakers. And it was interesting because you can actually convert a category cable into a speaker cable by twisting some of the cores together and just making two conductors. So you can actually convert an active endpoint to a passive cable infrastructure, but you can't do it the other way around. If you wire either low impedance or constant voltage wiring to your endpoint, you can't then make it a network endpoint without ripping the cable out and putting new cable in. So I would argue that most people should be wiring category cabling to the endpoint because they can go back from that. They probably won't want to because, as we've said, our speakers sound great and they're reliable. And I haven't heard of an instance where customers installed our gear and then pulled it out and installed conventional gear. But they could if they wanted to. But you can't do it the other way around.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. FYI, we're coming up on probably the last question. So if you have any questions, drop them in the chat down there. This is a question that this is my question, because I get the objection probably the first objection, the most used objection by consultants and by integrators would be phrased like this, and I'll not say it in a snarky way. Our customers aren't that picky. They want the least expensive way to deliver audio, and some technologies, I almost said it there, some technologies are just good enough. So what would you say to an integrator or an engineer or specifier that had that objection?
Oh, there's a lot of different things I might say. And actually, a word you used before I answer that question, I'm going to cover something that we didn't really cover beforehand, and it was a word you mentioned in there, which is injector. So when you're using power over Ethernet, sometimes you have existing infrastructure where the switches aren't PoE. And that doesn't exclude you from using PoE products. You then just use PoE injectors, and a PoE injector is an inline device, a mid-span device that goes between your switch and, in this case, your speaker, and has one RJ45 connector from the switch, which doesn't have power. It puts power into the line, and it then sends it on to the speaker. So you can actually retrofit your installation to be PoE, even if your switches are not PoE and they're already there. But in terms of, why not use a lowest common denominator 70-volt system or whatever? The first thing I'd say is we're never going to get those jobs. We're not cheap and cheerful or cheap and nasty. Choose your phrase. That's not the end of the market that we play in. So, yeah, there's always going to be customers beneath the area that we play in. We make extremely high quality product that allows you to do what your chef was doing and add audio to a curated experience, not just something that produces noise that prevents silence. That's not our place in the market. However, I would also say what I said earlier, which is the true cost of the system isn't just the cost of the boxes. It's how easy is it to install? How long does it take in labor? What specialized cabling do you have to have? Another point is how easy is it to expand later? So, for example, with us, you just string other speakers into the switch rather than having to buy a bigger amplifier or another amplifier. Or what happens if I decide to rezone my space and I just had one system, but now I want to have the option to have different music in the private dining room than in the restaurant? With a conventional system, that's completely rewiring it, putting in a second amplifier, a second player. With us, it's just a couple of clicks of software and rezoning that system into two zones, a private dining room zone and a main restaurant zone that can be playing either the same music if the doors are open or different music. And even if you didn't think about that at the beginning, it's super simple to do that. A final point is, and this is probably something we'll do a seminar on maybe even next month, but very, very soon after this one, is our partnership with Excite for monitoring. And what we're finding is monitoring a installation is a much requested feature. And what that is being able, either for the integrator or the larger end customer with multiple locations, to check that all of their installations are up and running and to be notified if there is a problem. Now, you can monitor all of our products, but the thing is, if you monitor one of our players, for example, it's going to tell you that in that installation, the music player is working fine. But it doesn't tell you whether the power amplifier is on or blown, or that the speakers are blown. So all you can do is monitor, the front end of the system. unless the amp manufacturer has his own monitoring system. But with conventional speakers, you can't monitor those. If you use our PoE solution, speaker solution, you're actually monitoring the endpoint. So basically, if that speaker's working, you're getting music out of there. So with the advent of remote monitoring and escalation procedures, that drives people even further towards what I would argue is the direction they should have been going in the first place, which is a modern, decentralized, easily changeable, easily expandable system that's now monitorable right to the endpoints. So yeah, there'll always be the people that take the cheap option. And in just the same way as if you're a quality car manufacturer, you're not going to sell to someone who's just after the lowest cost option. But if you're after a quality option that's flexible, that's monitorable, that's expandable, we're pretty much your choice.
I agree. Since I don't see any other questions, I just wanted to wrap up by saying, well, thanks for joining us live, or thanks for watching this at a later date and time. Send us any of your suggestions for what we should talk about later. You can look at our YouTube channel for a bunch of videos that Ross has done on how to do stuff. And feel free to connect with any of us on LinkedIn or reach out, and I'll let, I want to say goodbye, but let Ross and Graham say goodbye as well.
Great. Thanks for joining us today, and hope you learned something about PoE today.
Yes, thank you very much. In addition to what Craig said, our website, bluesoundprofessional.com, has a ton of information. We even have a special section about PoE speakers with some documentation about using PoE speakers. We have a whole range of PoE speakers, small, medium, and large wall speakers, now ceiling speakers and pendant speakers. So we have a wide variety of PoE speakers that you can choose from. You can also combine PoE options to our other players and player amps in a multi-zone solution. So you can use PoE in certain areas. We have people that do that and then use 70-volt solutions with our 70-volt amplifiers in the back of house areas, the toilets and things where audio quality is maybe not so important. So it's a totally flexible ecosystem, but bluesoundprofessional.com will get you a whole load of resources. And as Craig says, just feel free to reach out to any of the three of us.